Yesterday, when I sat down to write this sermon, with all that has happened just this week, all the many ideas and stories to tell were swirling around in my head. It was overwhelming. In that moment, as the screen is still without words, I unpaused the Today Show and listened to an author historian speak about the life of love and justice lived by John Lewis, the conscience of America. We mourn his passing. Somehow I'm grateful that he saw the most recent outpouring of grief for the unjust killing of George Floyd by police officers, that he heard the world say the names of those lost in the last few weeks and months. I watch photos of John Lewis from 1965 lined up with other protesters about to walk across the bridge in Selma, Alabama on Bloody Sunday. I see the terrible aftermath in which he and others were beaten by police and his skull was cracked and he said he thought he was going to die. In contrast, I also see on my Twitter feed photos of him in his iconic tan trench coat from that terrible time, right next to photos of him at Comic-Con a few years ago, wearing the same kind of coat and carrying a backpack, dressed up as the hero that is himself. He is leading children around the conference center, walking, marching to remember. The pictures of little children with him strikes me as achingly beautiful. Pain turned into beauty, evil turned to good, suffering and unimaginable heartbreak recreated. That's the work of our God. And as I turned from the TV and Twitter and set down my phone in order to begin to write, the first song on my playlist, a random selection of some of my favorite artists, is playing. It's a Tracy Chapman song called If Not Now, Then When. While I'm not one to think that God is constantly sending me messages, I do believe that if my eyes and my ears are open, I can experience God. In these hard days, I've heard God most through music. Tracy echoes in her songs the words that civil rights leaders said many times. If not now, then when? If not today, then why make your promises? A love declared for days to come is as good as none. You can wait till morning comes. You wait for the new day. You can wait and lose this heart. You can wait and soon be sorry. Now, love's the only thing that's free. We must take it where it's found. Pretty soon it may be costly. If not now, then when? We all must live our lives always feeling, always thinking, the moment has arrived. The now of God's kingdom is here, today. Today we can live our lives expecting our stories, our songs to change. This expectation of hope and freedom in Christ allows us to see and hear with God's eyes and ears, love with God's own hearts. Our brothers and sisters are still not free, and therefore we also are weighed down with heavy chains. It's the cost of love. Our country is in crisis. There is a virus that disproportionately affects Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and the poor. And there is an uncovering of the shame and evil of racism. Our eyes are more fully open, and our ears better hear cries of, I can't breathe, and mama. This virus and the sin of racism are not two separate issues for our country. They are connected. Friends, I would propose that refusing to wear a mask as an act of loving our neighbors is falling for the sin of racism. The sin that says, if someone is suffering, it's okay as long as it's not me. The sin that says, I don't have to worry about anyone but myself. The sin, the choice to close your eyes and cover your ears like a child and say, I can't hear you. Friends, we cannot turn our eyes away and refuse to hear the cries of our fellow Americans, our brothers and sisters, our friends, our children, for we belong to each other. We are our brothers and sisters' keepers. For if we are all made in God's image, then each and every person matters. That's why we can say Black Lives Matter. Because even now, many years after John Lewis was brutally attacked because he peacefully protested by merely walking over a bridge, our Black brothers and sisters are being killed by police, they are being killed by the coronavirus, and they are suffering because people like us have been silent for too long. Because people like us have refused to see and hear and know that God's love, God's kingdom, is a revolution of love, where hate can't find a foothold because we won't allow it. Mary, the mother of Jesus, knows of this kingdom we are trying to live into. She sings about it in Luke's gospel after agreeing to be the mother of the Son of God. Hear this paraphrase of Mary's song from the first chapter of Luke. I'm overflowing with thanks to God. I'm dancing to the song of God. God chose me of all people. I am blessed beyond words. God has done great things for me. Just look at me. God's mercy is endless. I hope my baby knows such mercy. I hope my baby knows a world full of God's creating, where the high and mighty proud are put in their place right alongside all of us. I hope my baby knows a world where tyrants and terrorists become harmless, and those whose lives never mattered all matter. I hope my baby knows a world where the hungry have a taste of plenty, and the overstuffed know the gnaw of hunger. I hope my baby knows a world where mercies pile higher than cruelties, and where the promise of peace cascades through every generation. Did you listen carefully? Did you hear the revolution of love? This mama-to-be hears the cries of people in pain. She listens and she dreams of God's kingdom made incarnate in Jesus Christ. Isabel Docampo says about this song, Mary gives us a moment in time where we don't have to accept the status quo. We don't have to live there. God is at work. God does not forget. God is with us. This is an opportunity to reimagine life together and life with God. Mary sings her love song about God's life-giving love and justice. She can sing this song because she has experienced for herself the overflowing nature of God's love. A love without limits, a love that includes even her, a love that includes the lowly and the poor. Notice that this is a steadfast love that implies justice within unconditional love. This kind of love is active, it's not passive, it's fierce, like the mother bear protecting her cubs. It's a love that never excludes anyone, no matter what. No one is left behind and everyone is proclaimed free. Docampo says that this love song sings us away from violence and toward peace. It sings us out of brokenness and into right relationship with God and others. It sings us away from power and greed and empire and toward mutuality and forgiveness and wholeness. God chose Mary to sing of a revolution. God chooses us to sing as well. We are called, friends, to be loved in this way because of all people. We should know that walking the path of suffering, carrying our cross, is the only way to follow Jesus. We can do hard things. Glennon Doyle says in her book, Untamed, being human is not hard because you're doing it wrong. It's hard because you're doing it right. You will never change the act that being human is hard, so you must change your idea that it was ever supposed to be easy. I was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1977. I lived almost all of my life in the state of South Carolina. It is a wonderful place to live. I grew up in a small town with many people of color, mostly African Americans. I had many teachers that were Black. My favorite teacher in high school was Mr. Campbell, who taught U.S. history. As a young Black man, he experienced integration in the South. He shared with us about that experience. I was able to see through his eyes and experience through his life a little bit of what it was like. Mr. Campbell had a strange but enduring love for President Nixon that I never understood, and he would often lift his arms and flash the double peace sign with a big grin on his face. I think that I was pretty fortunate to have learned from him. I've learned a lot over the years as my eyes and ears were opening to God's revolution of love. In 2015, a white man entered Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, a church that I passed by many times. And after the Black worshipers invited him to join them in Bible study, he opened fire, murdering 9 people. My home state and the nation was shocked by this terrible act. Mass shootings were just beginning to overwhelm our newsfeed. But somehow, the fact that this evil happened in a church and that this evil killed peaceful and Jesus-loving Black folks shook us to our core. So much so, the people of South Carolina held up the people and families of the victims from Mother Emanuel Church in prayer and called for justice, love. Because of this, many began to call for the removal of the Confederate flag from the State House in Columbia. People said things like this: this flag, the Confederate flag, stood for something that should no longer represent our state. But still, the flag flew, an affront to our Black brothers and sisters who lost their lives worshiping Jesus. The Washington Post published a new article to retell this story just a few days ago. I remember what happened clearly. On June 27, 2015, Bree Newsom Bass climbed the 30-foot flagpole at the South Carolina State House and took down the flag, a symbol of division, racism, and slavery. She and fellow protesters of all races planned the feat, and she says this in the article: I felt like I could do it. And when I felt like I would be the most impactful person to do this because my family was South Carolina and I was a Black woman. From there, it was figuring out all the other roles, she said. We needed someone who could help me over the fence, be a lookout. We decided it should be a white man because we wanted to communicate. It's not just the role of the people who are oppressed, but it's also on the people who have benefited from oppression, who have to be a part of this process. We walked over and James put his hands down so I could climb over the fence. She said, I stumbled and injured my hand, but I had so much adrenaline, I kept going. By the time the police took notice and started calling for me to come down, I was already up there. She was arrested after coming down, flag in hand. A few weeks later in South Carolina, they removed the flag and stuck it in a museum. Now, 5 years later, the protests of Black Lives Matter have led to the removal of a Confederate symbol on the flag for the state of Mississippi. Change is happening, but it's painful and slow, and the loss of life, the violence and hatred is hard to bear. In a leadership class I'm currently taking, the facilitator, Dr. Sam Chan, tells me and my cohort from Memphis Theological Seminary that pain equals growth. The pain and the cost of leadership that leads to growth is intense. The pain of carrying the cross. This mantle of pain comes at great cost. I'm sure that the leadership of Black Lives Matter knows this concept well. I also think that the Black church knows this. I'm not so sure that the church that is primarily white knows this, acknowledges this as reality. And I had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Chan about this very issue. He said that our American culture works against the embracing of pain and change that leads to growth. Our American culture wants easy answers, and we have settled for a surface-deep reality in which we want to think that the issue of racism has been solved, and we did all that during the 60s and the civil rights movement. People who buy into this culture say things like, protesters destroying property is unacceptable, instead of the loss of Black lives at the hands of police is unacceptable. They refuse to say that Black lives matter. One white man, a member of a former church in which I serve, said to me on Facebook, they, referring to Black people, have the criminal justice system too, when in fact it is the criminal justice system that is killing Black people. Trevor Noah has an excellent video piece about social contract and systematic racism that helped me understand the disconnect that occurs for many of us. If you haven't seen it, take a few minutes to watch it this week. He makes the point that each unjust story connects to the next, and the domino effect, the collapse of social contract is what we see when violence erupts. It makes sense. Black Americans are dealing with racism and the coronavirus. White people have weaponized our right to be superior, to not suffer pain, to not wear masks, and Black people are still paying the price. Trevor says, when you are upset about Target being looted, try to imagine how it must feel for Black Americans to watch Black bodies be looted every day. The police show Black people how valuable they are. It's happening because of the color of skin, and it's extremely painful. It hurts. And it hurts even more when people refuse to open their eyes and truly see. Now, I'm a white person. I'm speaking out about the pain and evil of racism. I'm attempting to be anti-racist, but I don't always get it right. I'm conditioned too. I have to fight against the culture of systematic racism to more fully bring into reality the justice revolution of love that comes from God. Part of that journey is realizing that I'm racist too. We like to separate ourselves and say we aren't like those people. It's an easy trap to fall into. Othering, it is sometimes called. We aren't the kind of people who suffer because it must be their fault. They haven't pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. When in fact, my whiteness allowed my grandparents to be educated, my grandparents and parents to own their own homes, for my parents to start a small business with a loan from the bank and send me to college. Racism helps me. I need to realize that even though it hurts, it's painful, even though it would be easier to deny, even though many of my white friends think that they are losing their rights as white Christian Americans and wish for the good old days when America was great. It's easy to think that. It's easy to think that when I break the law and get pulled over for a taillight, I'm safe. I don't even get a ticket. I say I'll take care of it right away, and I and my 3 children make it home alive and safe and unafraid. If pain equals growth, then all people that follow Jesus must lean in and be willing to experience pain in order for growth to occur. My friends, knowing God in spite of and in the midst of suffering changes us, recreates us. Then we can sing the song that we were meant to sing with our lives. Amen.